You people always think the rules don't apply to you. The words cut through the late afternoon air like a siren before any siren had even begun. On the corner of Peachtree and Walton in downtown Atlanta, where office workers hurried past food carts and the glow of traffic lights reflected off glass towers, Officer Daniel Mercer had his hand locked around Naomi Carter's wrist. His grip was firm, performative, meant less to restrain and more to humiliate. People slowed their steps. Some stared openly. Others kept walking, pretending they hadn't seen scenes like this before. Naomi stood still in a navy coat and low heels, one leather folder tucked beneath her arm, her posture straight as if the sidewalk itself belonged to her. She didn't pull away. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at him with a calm so steady it seemed to irritate him more than resistance ever could. Daniel Mercer was 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself like the badge on his chest was a crown no one could question. He had worked these streets long enough to know what fear looked like, long enough to mistake silence for weakness. And right now, the woman in front of him was refusing to give him either. "I asked you for identification," he barked, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Instead, you ignored a lawful order." Naomi's eyes never left his. "I said I was reaching into my purse," she replied, her tone level and controlled. "You chose not to listen." A few feet away, a teenager stopped with a grocery bag in one hand and lifted his phone. An older man in a Braves cap shook his head under his breath. Two tourists paused beside a map kiosk, unsure whether to watch or walk. Atlanta had seen enough moments like this to know how they usually ended. Daniel tugged her wrist slightly toward the curb where his patrol SUV idled with its lights dark. "Save it," he said. "You can explain downtown." Naomi glanced at the vehicle, then back at him. Not fear. Not anger. Something else. Something almost like patience. The city noise continued around them, crosswalk beeps, engines rolling through the intersection, the low murmur of people pretending not to be interested. Then from somewhere behind Daniel came the distant rise of sirens. Faint at first. Then clearer. He didn't turn around. Not yet. Officers heard sirens all day. They usually meant someone else's problem. "Last chance," he said, tightening his jaw. "Make this easy." Naomi's lips moved just enough to form a small smile. It wasn't smug. It wasn't nervous. It was the smile of someone who already knew the next page of the story. "Easy," she said quietly. "For who?" The question landed harder than shouting would have. Daniel's face hardened. He looked around, noticing more phones now pointed in his direction. A delivery driver stood beside his van recording openly. A woman pushing a stroller had stopped across the street. Even the teenager with the grocery bag had stepped closer. Public attention always changed the temperature of a moment. Daniel hated that. He stepped nearer, lowering his voice. "You think standing there calm makes you smart?" Naomi answered without blinking. "No. I think standing here calm makes me prepared." The sirens grew louder now, multiplying instead of fading. More than one unit. Maybe several. Daniel finally glanced over his shoulder, annoyed more than concerned. Red and blue reflections began dancing across nearby windows. The crowd shifted, people turning toward the sound. Naomi straightened her coat with her free hand as though she had all the time in the world. "Officer Mercer," she said softly, reading the nameplate on his chest as if noticing it for the first time. "You really should let go of my wrist now." Daniel Mercer turned fully this time, and for the first time since grabbing Naomi Carter on that crowded sidewalk, certainty slipped from his face. 3 unmarked black SUVs rolled through the intersection in a tight line, followed by 2 marked city units with lights flashing but sirens now fading into silence. Traffic halted. Pedestrians stepped back from the curb. The red and blue reflections washed over the windows of nearby stores and shimmered across the polished hood of Daniel's patrol vehicle. This was no routine response. This was organized. Precise. Deliberate. Daniel released Naomi's wrist without seeming to realize he had done it. The imprint of his fingers remained on the sleeve of her coat, but she did not glance down at it. Instead, she smoothed the fabric once and adjusted the leather folder beneath her arm. Calmly. Methodically. Like someone preparing for a meeting she had scheduled herself. The lead SUV door opened first. A tall man in a charcoal overcoat stepped out, silver at the temples, posture sharp, eyes locked straight ahead. Even from 20 feet away, officers on the street recognized him. Captain Marcus Reed did not waste steps or words. Beside him emerged a woman in a dark suit carrying a tablet and credentials clipped to her belt. Federal. Clean lines, measured expression, no interest in spectacle. Evelyn Brooks. Around them, additional personnel moved into place with the quiet efficiency of people who already knew exactly where everyone should stand. Daniel swallowed hard and straightened his uniform. Captain Reed, he called, forcing a laugh that landed nowhere. Did not expect you out here. Marcus Reed did not answer immediately. He took in the scene the way a judge studies a room before speaking. Phones held high. Citizens gathered in a half circle. One officer standing alone beside a patrol SUV. Naomi Carter centered in the middle of it all, composed and silent. Then Marcus looked at Daniel. I imagine there are many things you did not expect today, he said. The crowd grew still. Even the city seemed to lower its volume for a moment. Daniel shifted his weight. This woman was being detained for failure to comply, he said quickly. I was conducting lawful procedure. Naomi finally turned toward him, her expression unchanged. You never asked for my identification a second time, she said. You interrupted me before I could provide it. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. The teenager with the grocery bag kept recording. Across the street, someone whispered, "Oh no." Evelyn Brooks stepped forward and tapped twice on her tablet. Officer Mercer, she said, voice clear and professional, you are instructed to step away from your vehicle and remove all department equipment from your person pending immediate review. Daniel blinked. Pending what review? Marcus. Reed answered this one. Pending the review that began 8 months ago. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Daniel looked from Reed to Brooks, then to Naomi, and something colder than fear entered his face. Recognition. Not of who she was exactly, but of what she had been all along. Naomi opened the leather folder and withdrew a slim badge wallet along with a city credential sealed beneath clear laminate. She held it where only he needed to see it, though the effect reached everyone. Special Counsel, Civil Integrity Task Force, she said. Assigned to document misconduct patterns, unlawful stops, and discriminatory enforcement practices within multiple precinct zones. Daniel's lips parted slightly. You set me up. Naomi's eye sharpened for the first time. No, Officer Mercer. I gave you a choice in public daylight, with witnesses everywhere, and you made it yourself. No one spoke after that. Not the tourists. Not the stroller mother. Not the officers near the SUVs. The silence carried more weight than shouting ever could. Marcus Reed extended a hand toward Daniel's badge. Now, he said, voice low and final, we do this the easy way. Daniel Mercer stared at Captain Marcus Reed's outstretched hand as if the badge on his chest had suddenly become heavier than metal. Around him, cameras remained lifted, their tiny lenses catching every flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Only minutes earlier he had owned the sidewalk with the swagger of a man certain the world would bend around his uniform. Now even the afternoon wind seemed to move past him without permission. Captain, there has to be some misunderstanding, Daniel said, forcing a smile that looked thinner each second. I was doing my job. Marcus Reed did not move his hand. Then this should be easy to explain in the report room. Daniel glanced toward the crowd, searching for sympathy and finding none. The older man in the Braves cap folded his arms. The teenager with the grocery bag never lowered his phone. Across the street, office workers who had planned to be home by now stood rooted in place, held there by the rare sight of authority being asked to answer for itself. Naomi Carter remained composed beside the patrol vehicle, one hand resting lightly on the folder at her side. She did not celebrate. She did not smirk. She watched with the same steady patience she had shown from the first moment he touched her wrist. That patience unsettled Daniel more than anger ever could. Evelyn Brooks stepped forward and spoke with practiced clarity. Officer Mercer, this review includes body camera inconsistencies, stop pattern irregularities, citizen complaints, and conduct observations across multiple incidents. Daniel's eyes widened. Complaints? Anyone can file a complaint. True, Evelyn said. Patterns are harder to dismiss. The words landed like stones in shallow water, small at first, then spreading outward. Daniel tugged at the bottom of his uniform jacket. You are making me look guilty in front of everybody. Naomi answered before anyone else could. No, Officer Mercer. Your choices did that. A low murmur rolled through the crowd. Someone whispered, she got him there. Daniel turned sharply toward Naomi, then caught himself under the stare of 5 officers now watching him closely. He lowered his voice. Who are you really? Naomi met his eyes. Someone who listened when others were ignored. For a moment the city sounds returned, horns in the distance, train brakes 2 blocks away, the rhythmic beeping of a crosswalk signal. Life continuing while one man's certainty unraveled in public. Marcus Reed stepped closer. Badge. Daniel hesitated. It was only a second, maybe 2, but everyone saw it. Then slowly, with fingers no longer steady, he unclipped the shield from his chest and placed it into Marcus Reed's hand. The tiny metallic click was almost quiet, yet it carried farther than any siren had. Some sounds announce emergencies. Others announce endings. Daniel looked suddenly smaller without it. Not physically smaller, but diminished, as if the space around him had stopped pretending he was bigger than everyone else. Evelyn signaled toward one of the SUVs. You will ride with us. Am I under arrest? Daniel asked, voice tight. You are under investigation, she replied. What happens next depends on what the facts say. Naomi finally stepped forward, close enough for only him and those nearest to hear clearly. Do you know the difference between power and respect? She asked. Daniel said nothing. Power can be taken in one afternoon, she said. Respect is built over years and lost in seconds. He looked away first. The crowd noticed that too. As Daniel was guided toward the waiting vehicle, the older woman with the stroller crossed the street and stopped beside Naomi. Thank you, she said softly. My son was treated the same way last year. Naomi's expression softened for the first time all day. Then today was not only about me. The SUV door closed. The lights no longer flashed. Yet somehow the street looked brighter than it had before. By sunset, the video had spread farther than anyone standing on that Atlanta sidewalk could have imagined. It moved from phones to group chats, from neighborhood pages to local feeds, then to national accounts hungry for a story where the usual ending had been interrupted. Frame by frame, viewers watched Officer Daniel Mercer grip Naomi Carter's wrist, heard the sharpness in his voice, saw the calm in hers, then watched the arrival of vehicles that changed the balance of the entire scene. Millions of people recognized something in those seconds. Some recognized anger. Others recognized fear. Many recognized history. Inside police headquarters on Mitchell Street, the atmosphere felt nothing like the confidence Daniel once carried through its halls. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Elevators opened and closed. Shoes crossed polished floors with the hurried rhythm of people who suddenly wanted distance from a name they had defended for years. Daniel sat alone in interview room 3, jacket folded beside him, collar open, badge gone. Without the shield pinned to his chest, he looked less like a symbol and more like a man who had mistaken symbols for character. Across from him sat Evelyn Brooks with a recorder on the table and a file thick enough to bow at the center. Captain Marcus Reed stood near the one-way glass, arms folded, saying little. He did not need to. The room already understood why he was there. Let us start simple, Evelyn said. Why did you detain Naomi Carter? Daniel leaned back and tried to recover an old tone of control. Suspicious behavior. Define suspicious. He hesitated. She ignored commands. Evelyn opened the file. Multiple witnesses state she calmly told you she was reaching for identification. Daniel's jaw tightened. Witnesses do not know procedure. Perhaps, Evelyn replied. But cameras know timing. She slid several still images across the table. Each showed the same thing from different angles. Naomi standing still. Daniel escalating. A crowd gathering. Daniel looked at the photos as though they belonged to someone else. This is political, he muttered. Marcus Reed finally spoke. No. This is documented. Silence settled heavily over the room. Outside, officers passed the glass more slowly than usual, pretending not to look in. Inside the city, talk radio hosts argued. Comment sections exploded. Old complaints resurfaced with dates, names, and stories people once believed would be buried forever. Naomi Carter was in a conference room upstairs reviewing statements with city attorneys. She had changed nothing about her appearance except removing the coat Daniel had wrinkled hours earlier. The same calm remained. A young administrative assistant entered carrying coffee with hands that trembled slightly. Ms. Carter, she said softly, my father told me never to trust reporting anything. He said nobody listens. Naomi accepted the cup and gave a small nod. Sometimes they do, she said. Sometimes they need proof first. Back downstairs, Evelyn placed another folder on the table. Citizen complaints. Traffic stop data. Use of discretion reports. Internal notes with missing signatures. Daniel stared at the stack as if paper itself had betrayed him. Everybody made me the face of this, he said. I was not the only one. Marcus Reed stepped closer. Then today may help more than you realize. Daniel looked up sharply. You think this is justice? Marcus held his gaze. No. I think this is the beginning of it. In the hallway outside, two younger officers stood near a vending machine, speaking in low voices. Did you see the crowd? One asked. Yeah, the other said. They were not. Shocked he got stopped. They were shocked someone finally did it. And somewhere across Atlanta, as daylight faded behind towers of steel and glass, people who had grown used to swallowing moments of humiliation felt something unfamiliar rising in its place. Not revenge. Not celebration. Relief. The next morning, rain tapped softly against the tall windows of City Hall as Atlanta woke to headlines it could not ignore. Screens in coffee shops replayed the sidewalk footage. Morning anchors used phrases like accountability, misconduct, and overdue reckoning. Radio callers argued. Commentators speculated. But in neighborhoods where people had learned to lower their eyes and keep moving, the reaction was quieter and deeper. They had seen public humiliation before. What felt new was seeing it interrupted. On the 8th floor of the municipal building, a special review session had been called before sunrise. Long oak tables filled the chamber. Attorneys arranged folders. Staff members whispered over laptops. Reporters waited behind velvet ropes with notebooks open. At the center sat members of the Civil Oversight Board, faces serious, voices measured, aware that every sentence spoken inside that room would travel far beyond it. Naomi Carter entered without ceremony carrying the same leather folder she had held on the sidewalk. No security escort. No dramatic announcement. Just steady footsteps across polished floors. Yet conversations faded the moment she walked in. Some people command rooms with volume. Others do it with truth everyone already senses. Captain Marcus Reed greeted her near the witness table. You ready? He asked quietly. Naomi glanced at the rows of cameras, the city seal on the wall, the empty chair reserved for Daniel Mercer's counsel. I was ready 8 months ago, she said. Downstairs, a line had formed outside in the rain. Residents from every side of the city waited with umbrellas and folded papers in hand. Some carried complaint numbers. Some carried photographs. Some carried nothing but memory. A retired school bus driver named Gloria Thomas stood near the front clutching a worn envelope. "I filed 3 times, she told a reporter. Nobody called back once." Beside her stood a young father with his teenage son. "We are here so he can see what standing up looks like," the father said. Back inside headquarters, Daniel Mercer sat in an office that once opened doors for him. Now the blinds were half closed and no one knocked to ask if he needed coffee. His union representative shuffled papers across the desk. "Do not speculate. Answer only what is asked." Daniel stared at the muted television mounted on the wall. There was Naomi taking her seat. There was the crowd outside. There was his own image frozen mid-frame from yesterday, hand outstretched toward a woman who had never once looked afraid of him. "They made me a symbol overnight," he said bitterly. The representative adjusted his tie. Symbols are built long before cameras arrive. At 10:03, the hearing began. Naomi was sworn in and seated beneath bright lights that made every expression easier to read. The board chair asked the first question. "Ms. Carter, why were you assigned to this inquiry?" Naomi opened her folder and placed several documents on the table with careful precision. "Because repeated complaints were dismissed individually," she said. "Patterns survive when incidents are isolated." Pens moved quickly across reporter pads. Camera lenses tightened. Even staff members pretending neutrality leaned forward. "And what did you find?" asked another board member. Naomi looked directly ahead. A culture where certain citizens were treated as suspects first, neighbors second, and people last. The chamber fell still. Outside, rain continued to strike the stone steps in steady rhythm. Inside, truth had begun speaking in complete sentences. Daniel watched from the office television as if distance might soften the words. It did not. His phone remained face down on the desk. It had stopped ringing sometime in the night. Upstairs, Naomi turned another page in the file. "This is not about one officer," she said. One officer was simply confident enough to act in public. Somewhere in the back row, an older woman began to cry quietly. No cameras turned toward her. They stayed fixed on Naomi Carter. But many in the room understood the tears were not from sadness alone. Sometimes people cry when pain returns. Sometimes they cry when it finally leaves. The hearing room felt smaller by noon, not because the walls had moved, but because truth takes up space once it enters. Every seat was filled. Late arrivals stood along the back wall shoulder to shoulder, coats damp from the morning rain. Reporters refreshed batteries and memory cards. City staff who once treated oversight meetings like background noise now watched every word as if it might include their own names next. Naomi Carter remained at the witness table, posture steady, voice measured, never rushing to dramatize what facts could already carry. She turned another page in her folder and began reading dates, locations, and outcomes with calm precision. Traffic stops with no citation. Searches with no cause. Complaints marked unresolved, then quietly archived. Patterns hidden inside paperwork because paperwork often looks harmless until someone lines it up. "How many incidents involve Officer Mercer?" a board member asked. Naomi did not look down. Directly documented, 23. Indirectly connected through supervisor notes and partner statements, significantly more. A low stir moved through the chamber. 23 was not a mistake. 23 was a system giving itself permission over and over again. In the back row, Gloria Thomas gripped the worn envelope in her lap so tightly the edges bent. Beside her, the teenage boy who came with his father stared forward without blinking, learning that numbers can tell stories adults once tried to hide. Across town, Daniel Mercer sat in a private conference room with the television volume turned low. His union representative spoke in careful legal language, but Daniel barely listened. He kept hearing Naomi's sentence from the sidewalk. "You made the choice yourself." Men like Daniel had always believed consequences arrived from outside. He was beginning to understand they often begin within. We can challenge procedure, the representative said. We can question scope. Daniel shook his head slowly. Can you challenge video? The man said nothing. Back in the chamber, Captain Marcus Reed was called to testify. He walked to the table with the quiet authority of someone who had carried responsibility longer than applause. When sworn in, he did not clear his throat or adjust papers. He simply answered. Captain Reed asked the chairwoman, when did leadership become aware of recurring concerns? He held her gaze. Years ago. The room tightened. Then why was no meaningful action taken? Marcus exhaled once. Because institutions often confuse avoiding embarrassment with maintaining order. Pens moved rapidly. Camera shutters clicked. Some truths do not explode. They settle heavily, making everyone feel the floor beneath them differently. Marcus continued. We retrained. We reassigned. We delayed. We hoped patterns would disappear if we renamed them. Even Naomi looked at him then, not with surprise, but with recognition. It takes uncommon courage to expose others. Sometimes it takes more to admit where you stood nearby. Outside City Hall, the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through clouds and lit the wet steps where the line of waiting residents had only grown longer. Staff members began collecting statements from those still outside. Elderly hands passed over documents. Young voices described nights they had not forgotten. For the first time, the building seemed less like a fortress and more like a doorway. Then the board chair asked the question many had waited for. Captain Reed, in your judgment, did Officer Mercer believe he would face consequences for his conduct yesterday? Marcus did not hesitate. No, or why not? He looked briefly toward the cameras, then toward the city seal above the dais. Because too many times before yesterday, he was correct. The words landed harder than accusation because they carried confession with them. Daniel reached for the remote and muted the screen entirely, but silence could not protect him now. In the chamber, Naomi closed her folder and folded her hands. She had not raised her voice once all day. She had not needed to. The loudest thing in the room was no longer outrage. It was evidence. By late afternoon, the city no longer waited to hear what would happen. It was already deciding what should. Outside City Hall, the crowd had doubled. Office workers on lunch break stood beside pastors in dark coats, college students holding homemade signs, retired veterans leaning on canes, mothers with children asking quiet questions. Television vans lined the curb. Reporters spoke into cameras while glancing over their shoulders, aware the real story was unfolding behind them in a chamber where excuses were running out of room. Inside, the Civil Oversight Board reconvened after a short recess. The air felt different now. Earlier, people had arrived curious. Now they returned certain something larger than one hearing was taking place. Naomi Carter resumed her seat with the same composed focus she had carried all day. Before her lay the folder that had become heavier with meaning each hour. Across the room, an empty chair still marked where Daniel Mercer had been invited to appear in person. He had declined. The absent spoke loudly enough. The chairwoman adjusted her glasses and addressed the room. We have reviewed testimony, public evidence, internal records, and sworn statements. We will now issue preliminary findings. No one moved. Even camera operators steadied themselves as if afraid motion might interrupt history. Daniel watched from the conference room downtown where the television volume was turned back on. His representative had stepped outside to take a call, leaving him alone with the screen and himself. He sat forward now, elbows on knees, as though posture alone could change outcomes. Effective immediately, the chairwoman continued, Officer Daniel Mercer is suspended without pay pending final termination proceedings and referral for civil rights review. The chamber inhaled as one body. Some covered their mouths. Others nodded slowly as if confirming something long overdue. Gloria Thomas lowered her head and cried into the envelope she still held. The teenage boy beside her looked at his father with widened eyes. His father whispered, "Remember this day." On the television, Daniel's face emptied. Suspension was one thing. Without pay was another. Referral meant doors beyond the department were now opening in the worst direction possible. He stood abruptly, paced 3 steps, then stopped when he realized there was nowhere to go. In the chamber, the chairwoman continued. Further, this board recommends an independent audit of discriminatory enforcement complaints across all precinct zones over the past 5 years. This time the reaction was louder. Not cheering exactly. Something deeper. The sound people make when a locked room finally opens. Captain Marcus Reed remained still near the side wall, but those who knew him noticed the subtle release in his shoulders. Leadership had costs too, especially when silence had once seemed easier. Then the chairwoman turned toward Naomi. "Ms. Carter, your investigative findings were instrumental to these proceedings. This city acknowledges your service." Naomi rose. Dozens of eyes followed her. She could have spoken about vindication. She could have named pain, anger, humiliation. Instead she chose something harder. "Do not thank me if this ends with me," she said. Her voice was calm, carrying without force. "Thank the people who filed reports when no one answered. Thank the families who kept records no one requested. Thank those who were told to move on and did not." The room fell silent again. Some statements do not need volume because they arrive already true. Daniel lowered himself back into the chair, staring at the screen where Naomi stood taller than anyone in the room without trying to. He thought of the sidewalk, of the moment he heard sirens and assumed they belonged to someone else. Outside, sunlight broke fully through the clouds and struck the front steps of City Hall in bright bands across wet stone. People emerged from the building into the light carrying copies of complaint forms, hearing notes, and something harder to print. Hope. And in a quiet conference room several blocks away, Daniel Mercer finally understood that power borrowed from fear can disappear in a single day, but the memory of how you used it can last much longer. The morning after the ruling, Atlanta sounded different. Not quieter, not calmer, but clearer somehow. On trains heading downtown, strangers discussed oversight boards and complaint numbers. In barber shops, church parking lots, and coffee lines, people repeated Naomi Carter's words from the hearing. "Do not thank me if this ends with me." Some wrote them on poster board. Some posted them online. Some simply carried them in silence. At police headquarters, new memos appeared before sunrise. Mandatory review procedures. Body camera compliance checks. Community reporting hotlines staffed by civilians instead of internal desks. Supervisors who once moved slowly now moved with sudden urgency, the kind institutions discover when consequences finally become real. Captain Marcus Reed walked the halls without escort, stopping at desks, answering difficult questions, and hearing others he should have asked years earlier. Leadership, he knew now, was not measured by how long you kept order. It was measured by what truths you could bear to face. Daniel Mercer spent the morning in his apartment with curtains half closed against a bright Georgia sun. His service plaque leaned against a wall where it had fallen the night before. The television remained off. His phone lit up only with statements from attorneys and one message from a former colleague that read, "Should have listened years ago." He read it 3 times. Then he set the phone face down and stared at nothing for a long while. There are moments when a person loses a title. Harder moments come when they meet themselves without it. Across town, Naomi arrived at a neighborhood community center on Auburn Avenue where folding chairs had been arranged in rows. No cameras had been invited, yet the room filled anyway. Elderly residents came carrying folders of old correspondence. Young parents came with children who colored at the back tables. College students brought laptops to help scan documents. On the wall hung a handmade sign reading "Public Listening Session." Naomi moved from chair to chair, shaking hands, listening more than speaking. Gloria Thomas arrived with the worn envelope she had clutched for years. She placed it carefully on the table in front of Naomi. Inside were copies of 3 complaints, yellowed with age, each stamped received and never answered. Naomi read them quietly. "I thought maybe I kept them for no reason," Gloria said. Naomi looked up gently. "Sometimes people save paper," she said. "Sometimes they save proof." Nearby, the teenage boy from the hearing asked Captain Reed if things would really change this time. Marcus considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Only if people keep asking that," he said. The boy nodded as if handed a task rather than an answer. By afternoon, volunteers had created a line down the hallway to collect statements. Stories once told in kitchens and parked cars were now being written in ink beneath fluorescent lights. A mother described a humiliating stop outside a grocery store. A veteran described being ignored when he asked for badge numbers. A nurse described teaching her daughter to stay calm before teaching her to drive. No shouting filled the room. No spectacle. Just testimony, which is often stronger than noise. Naomi stepped outside for a breath of air as the sun lowered between brick buildings. Children played basketball on a cracked court nearby, their laughter bouncing against walls that had heard too much sorrow for too many years. Captain Reed joined her on the sidewalk. "You could have taken a quieter assignment," he said. Naomi smiled faintly. "Quiet is how this lasted so long." He looked toward the crowded entrance. "What do you think happens now?" She watched another family walk in carrying folders under one arm and hope under the other. "Now," she said, "the city decides whether yesterday was a headline or a beginning." Far across town, Daniel Mercer finally turned on the television. Every channel showed lines of citizens outside a community center, waiting patiently to be heard. No one mentioned him first anymore. For the first time in years, he was no longer the center of the story. He was only one chapter in it. 2 weeks later, the line outside the Auburn Avenue Community Center had become something no one expected and everyone needed. It wrapped around the block each morning before the doors opened, then formed again the next day. Teachers stood beside mechanics. Nurses beside retirees. Teenagers beside grandparents who had lived long enough to recognize the difference between ceremony and change. Inside, volunteers scanned documents, attorneys reviewed cases, counselors spoke with families, and city staff who once hid behind procedure now answered questions face to face. What began as a response had become a reckoning. Naomi Carter moved through the room with the same quiet steadiness she had carried on that sidewalk. She listened to each person as if time belonged to them. A young mother described teaching her son how to stay calm during traffic stops before teaching him how to parallel park. A retired mail carrier unfolded a citation from 12 years earlier and said he had kept it because it reminded him not to forget what being dismissed felt like. A college student admitted she had never trusted filing complaints until now. Naomi never rushed them. People who have been ignored can hear impatience like thunder. Captain Marcus Reed arrived each morning before sunrise and often left after dark. He sat in folding chairs, took notes by hand, and called precinct commanders directly when residents named patterns that still continued. Some officers resented him. Some respected him. Many were still deciding. But even critics could see one thing clearly. He was no longer protecting the appearance of order. He was trying to earn the substance of it. Across the city, Daniel Mercer walked into a small grocery store wearing a baseball cap pulled low. He wanted milk, bread, and the privilege of being unnoticed. But consequences do not always shout. Sometimes they arrive in glances, in whispers, in the cashier who recognizes your face and becomes suddenly formal. He stood in line while a television above the checkout counter played coverage of the community center. Naomi was on screen speaking beside volunteers. The caption beneath her name read Special Counsel for Civil Integrity Reform. Daniel looked away, but the reflection in the freezer glass showed the screen anyway. He paid in cash and left carrying a paper bag that felt heavier than it should have. That afternoon, the Civil Oversight Board released its final ruling. Termination upheld. Pension review pending. Mandatory reforms expanded citywide. News alerts flashed across phones, but the reaction at the community center was subdued. No cheers. No celebration. Many there understood that removing one man did not erase what allowed him to thrive. Still, relief moved through the room like warm light. Gloria Thomas approached Naomi with tears in her eyes and no envelope in her hands this time. "I think I can throw those papers away now," she said. Naomi smiled gently. "Keep them if you want," she replied. "But now they belong to history, not your burden." Outside, evening settled over Atlanta in gold and amber bands across brick walls and wet pavement left by a passing shower. Children dribbled basketballs nearby. Traffic rolled steadily. Life, indifferent and miraculous, kept moving. Marcus Reed joined Naomi on the front steps as the last visitors filed out carrying pamphlets, case numbers, and a little more trust than they had brought in. "Do you think people will remember all this?" he asked. Naomi watched a father hold the door for an elderly woman he had met only an hour earlier. "They will remember how it felt," she said. "That lasts longer than headlines." He nodded slowly. "And him?" Naomi knew who he meant without asking. She looked toward the city skyline where lights flickered on one by one. "Some men think the badge made them important," she said. "Then one day they learn it only revealed who they already were." The streetlights hummed to life. Somewhere in the distance, sirens rose and faded through the night, no longer a warning, no longer a threat, just a reminder that sound changes depending on who it is coming for.